Hello everyone, Kareem here from Afternerd.com, and today we are going to talk about how to ask Python about the weather anywhere in the world. So let's jump right into it. So the first thing that we need to know before we jump to the code and write some code to do this is to kind of know where to get the data from. So there is a service called Open Weather Map. So if you Google Open Weather Map, it's the first result in Google. And when you come to their page, up here you'll see something called API. And basically what Open Weather Map does is it provides an API for developers or for companies so that they can be able to programmatically get the weather of any city in the world. So if we click on the API, you'll see that they have different types of APIs that returns different information. The one we're basically interested in is the current weather data. So this is the one that we're going to be using in this tutorial. The first thing that you will need to do is to click on subscribe, and you'll see that they have different tiers. They have a free tier and they have some tiers where you pay. The free tier is fine. There is some restrictions. You are only allowed 60 API calls per minute and you have 1 million calls per month. You can't go beyond that, but for educational purposes, that's more than enough. So it tells you that it gives you all this data. So the current weather, minute forecast up to the hour, hourly forecast, and so on and so forth. So the first thing that you will need to do here is to click on the Get API key and fill in the information here so that you can sign up for the service. Once you sign up for the service, you get something called an API key. The API key, it's something that you will find in different services as well, different API services. The API key is a way of, let's call it weak authentication. But you will need this API key for every request that you send. If you send a request to this service asking about the temperature in a specific city without an API key, you're not going to get any data back. Because to them, you're not subscribed to the service, you don't have an API key, you're not authenticated. They have no idea who you are, so they will not return any data back. You're probably going to get something like authentication error, or you're going to get an error message saying that you don't have the API key in the request. Okay, so far, you come to this website, you sign up so that you can use the service. They give you an API key, and each request you send to the Open Weather Map service, you send the API key in the request itself. And we'll see how to do that in a little bit. But for now, I want to go back to the API and then click on the API documentation. So this is where you can look at all the different APIs that they provide, how to send a request, and what to expect in a response. And this is going to be a common theme when you interact with any API service. You basically want to look at the API documentation, look at the requests, how to structure the requests, what kind of parameters does the request require, and then you would also want to look at how the response is formatted. So if you look at this section, call current weather data for one location. This is basically what we want. We want to be able to provide our Python program with a city name and get the current temperature in the city. So if we come here and look at the API that we want to use, we'll see that this is an example of an API call that we can make. This first part over here is called the endpoint, and then after the question mark, you have your query parameters. In this case, we have two query parameters. One is called Q, which takes the city name. The other one is the app ID, which takes the API key that we talked about before, that you need to submit with every request that you send. And down here, you'll see a summary of all the different parameters that this endpoint can take. So for example, Q is going to be the city name or state code if you're in the US. City name is fine for what we're doing right now, but you can read more about it and see all the different things that the Q parameter can take. The app ID, we talked about it. It's basically the unique API key that you have, that you get once you sign up. The mode is the response format. So basically this service allows you to return the response in different formats, XML, HTML. By default, it's JSON, and most of the services out there, they actually provide a JSON format. So we're going to be dealing with JSON because it's more popular as a response format for the majority of the services out there. And then we have another parameter called units. And this parameter allows you to control the unit of measurement for the temperature. So for example, standard, which I think is using Kelvin, the metric system is using the Celsius, imperial is using the Fahrenheit. So you basically can control the type or the unit of measurement for temperature in the response that you get. And finally, there's another parameter called lang, which allows you to control the language of the response. Okay, so that seems pretty straightforward. So now we learned everything we need to know about the request, about the HTTP request that we will send to the service. Okay? Now let's look at the response. So if we go down to the response and specifically the JSON response, you'll see based on the request that you send, the API response is going to look like this. So you have a bunch of information like the coordinates, the weather, some string description of what the weather is like. We're interested in the temperature. So let's see. Oh, so the temperature is here. So you have a key called main, and then inside this key, there is the temperature, which is the current temperature. And then you have the min and the max. Let's make sure. Yeah. So here's the description. So main.temp is the temperature. Default unit is Kelvin, like we said. And then in metric is Celsius. Imperial is Fahrenheit. Okay. So basically, here's what we want to do. We basically want to write a Python program. This Python program will send an HTTP request to this service using the endpoint that we saw earlier. And then we send the query parameters that we want, for example, the city name, the unit of measurement, all of these different parameters that the service allows us to control. And then we get back the response. Once we get back the response, we parse the response as JSON. We look into the main key, specifically the temperature, so main and then temp, and this is going to be the current temperature, and then we print this out to the user. So yeah, let's code this out and see how we can write the code for this. So the first thing we need to do is to define a function. Let's call it getWeather. And this function is going to be the function that actually calls, it sends an HTTP GET request to the service, to the OpenWeatherMap service, and gets back the response and returns this response to the caller of the function. Okay, so this function should take some arguments. First of all, it should take the app ID that we talked about. This is a required argument. It should also take all the query parameters that should be sent with the requests. So there are two ways I can do this. I can either put the query parameters here like units, lang, the city name as well. But a cleaner way of doing this is to actually just define a class for the parameters. So let's say class, let's call it weather params. And this class will have the following. So this class is supposed to represent the parameters, the query parameters that you send with the request, right? So it needs these fields. So let's define our init function. Don't forget the self. And then it has the following. It has the city name. This is one of the query parameters. Another query parameter was the units, and then the lang, and then the mode. And then all we need to do here is just say self.city is equal to city, self.units is equal to units, self.lang is equal to lang. Okay, I could have used also a data class for this, since this class basically only has data. We don't really need to have any sort of methods for this class. Another thing we can do here is to define defaults. So for example, since I am in the US, I'm going to say that this is imperial. The language, let's say the default value is English, and the mode is JSON. And actually, since we are only going to work with JSON responses, let's not even have that as a parameter. Let's force our mode to be JSON. I think these are all the query parameters that we care about here in the getWeather function. So in addition to the app ID, we also need to provide it with some params, which is going to be an instance of the weather params that we defined here. Okay, so the getWeather function, this is the function that should send the HTTP request and then get back the response. So for that, to be able to send HTTP requests, you know, in Python, we have this beautiful module called requests. We are going to be using this. And then over here, we need to define what our endpoint is. So the endpoint is, if we go back to this website, you'll see that here's the endpoint. So the endpoint is the URL without the query parameters. So let's go back here and paste it. And let's not forget the scheme. And then the next thing is to define the query parameters. I'm going to leave it empty for now. I'll fill it up later. So now to send an HTTP request using the requests library, what you need to do is you call the requests.get, because this is an HTTP get method. We're sending a get method. If you don't know what an HTTP get, or if you're not familiar with HTTP, it's more of an advanced topic, but it's very important if you want to be a solid programmer. So requests.get, what we need to add here is the endpoint that we are sending the request to. And then we want to also add the query parameters. So the requests.get function takes a key argument called params, and this will basically be populated with the query params, which we are going to fill. And just to avoid confusion, I'm going to name this argument here weather params instead of params. It would have worked either way, but just to avoid confusion, because I don't want to confuse you, we need to capture the response of that. So this function, the requests.get, pretty much sends the requests and returns back the HTTP response that you get back, and we will have this response in this variable, the resp variable. There's another typo here. This should be requests. And then finally, we just need to return the response.json. Okay, now let's go over the function, make sure it's doing what we want. So we define the endpoint, which is a string pointing to the service, to where the service is. And then after that, we define another variable called query parameters, which is a dictionary, and it's going to be the query parameters that we send with the request. We use the requests module to send an HTTP GET request. We capture the HTTP response in another variable, and then we return the JSON response. Now, the only thing that is missing here is to actually fill the query parameters. So let's take a look at what the query parameters looked like. So let's see. So we have queue, app ID, mode, units, and lang. So queue is going to be the weather params.city. Units is going to be weather params.units. The language is weather params.lang, and then the mode is weather params.mode, which is always JSON. And then finally, the app ID is going to be the app ID that is passed to the getWeather function. Okay, so now we have our query parameters filled. Now the only thing missing is to write the main function, so let's do that. So let's say if name is equal to main. We define a variable called the app ID, where we put the app ID here. And then the city name, let's call it, let's do San Francisco. And before we call the getWeather function, we need to instantiate a weather params instance. We want to create an object from weather params. So let's say params is equal to weather params. And let's see, the init function takes city, and then units, and then lang. Let's use the default values for units and lang. And then for the city, we are just going to pass the city name. So that should be enough for our weather params object. Now we just need to call the function. So let's say get weather. And like I said, it takes the app ID and then an instance of the weather params. So the app ID is already defined here in the main function, and the params is also already defined. So the getWeather function is going to return a JSON object. If we want to get the current temperature, like I said, we need to look at the main and then temp. So if we do this, this is going to be the current temperature in the city that we have here. Let's print this out and let's make it a little bit user-friendly. So let's do this. Let's say current temperature in city name is, and then we call this function here. And that should be it. Let's run this code and see what we get. So if we run this program, weather.py, we get that the current temperature in San Francisco is, this should be is, 58 degrees. And that is, of course, degrees Fahrenheit. What if we want to know the temperature in Celsius? So if we want to know the temperature in Celsius, all we need to do is change the params instance. So here, in addition to the city name, we can say units is equal to metric, and that should give us the result in Celsius. If you want to change the city, you can change the city here. So for example, if instead of San Francisco, I say New York, and then we check the temperature, that's in Celsius. Let's return it back to imperial. 67 degrees. So it's warmer in New York City than it is in San Francisco. Surprise. All right, let's actually check that this data is correct. So let's go to Google and type weather in New York. And you can see it's 68. Our Python program said it's 67. So I'll consider that a correct answer. Let's check San Francisco. And you get it is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Our code said that it's 58. I'll consider that a correct answer as well. So yeah, this is how you automate getting the temperature, knowing about the weather in Python. Of course, you can take this idea, you can take this concept of talking to a service, getting back the temperature farther. For example, you can send yourself a text message every single day about what the weather is going to be like, or you can send an email to yourself. There are many different ways you can take a program like this and build on top of it. I hope this was useful for you, and I'll see you in the next video.